Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next video in our series of short conversations we're hosting about Biden's supply chain policies and what in-house counsel and compliance personnel should know about these policies and what the legal and compliance related risks are. I'm Kerry Contini. I'm a partner in Baker McKenzie's international trade practice in the Washington, D.C. office. And in this video, the focus is on another supply chain that has been the focus of the administration's efforts. We're focusing now on large capacity batteries. You'll also hear the term high capacity batteries, which are a really important part of the energy transition and clean energy supply chains. They're used in everything from electric vehicles to grid storage to even defense applications. The administration issued a report in June of last year with policy recommendations for the supply chain and has been at work on these issues since then. The White House has set an ambitious target of 50% electric vehicle sale shares in the US by 2030, and has also released an action plan to support electric vehicle charging stations. So it's been a priority of the clean energy policy of the administration. But the administration is concerned that domestic production is not going to keep up with an anticipated increase in demand. So really the policies that we're seeing boil down to policies to increase domestic production while also addressing environmental concerns. We are joined today by three experts in our Baker McKenzie offices in North America: Doug Sanders, a partner in our environmental practice in Chicago; Christine Streatfeild, a partner in our DC practice focusing on trade remedies and other trade issues; and Rafic Barrage, a tax partner in our DC office. Doug, turning to you, how are Biden's supply chain policies affecting environmental regulation for this supply chain?
Thanks, Kerry. Well, as you sort of touched on, and I think it's probably known, climate change is a huge focus of the Biden administration. And in the infrastructure bill that passed and in a lot of the focus in the executive orders and otherwise, electric vehicles certainly, and then battery capacity and storage are key sort of components to meeting those goals. Shifting away from gas-powered vehicles to electric vehicles, and then creating secondary storage for wind and solar are two sort of key components of meeting those goals. And that ties into, in particular with respect to batteries, a couple of points in the environment. One, there's a gap in what we do at the end life. To be sustainable, we're really trying to create a sort of circular economy viewpoint of what we do with batteries, and that means recycling them at the end. But we don't have a comprehensive federal sort of law that deals with that. They're arguably treated in different ways, and it's somewhat confusing. And so one thing that I think we should be looking at down the road is whether or not at a federal level or a state level, there will be some sort of extended producer responsibility or mandated recycling law, which actually can have the benefit in some ways of increasing capacity on the front end, because we do have a lack and a gap in finding the minerals here in the United States domestically to put in the batteries in the first instance. And so if we can take more out here and process and recycle them in this country, which is a big component of their plans, that sort of creates and generates its market. But it's going to have to be regulated. It's have to be done safely. And this administration has a lot of concerns about that, not just doing it generally, but also from the environmental justice sort of component of where these facilities get put. How does it happen? The other point, which gets a little bit into companies and even more broadly, their sort of ESG profiles of what they're doing, is where the minerals come from, in particular cobalt. So much of the world's cobalt comes from the DRC. There's reported problems there with human trafficking, child labor, slave labor, and other issues. And so to rely on that source of minerals and to use that in your products can open you up to potential claims, which has happened under the TVPRA in DC, although those claims have been dismissed against some major tech companies and Tesla. But we can expect more of that. And so when companies are thinking about going EV and using these sorts of things to broaden their profile or reduce carbon emissions, they do really have to be careful about greenwashing and how they're talking about what they're doing, because you don't want to create more waste. That's not a good component, and you want to make sure you're you're getting batteries and you're supplying the materials for them from sustainable sources, or at least you're adequately describing what you're actually doing and how your supply chain is dealing with these issues.
Thanks, Doug. So you've really touched on a really important bucket of environmental legal risks and related compliance risks. And I wanted to turn to Christine to ask about some of the trade-related legal and compliance risks that we're seeing based on the Biden administration's policies. We know that the Biden administration has created a trade strike force that's intended to examine trade practices that may affect this supply chain and components that go into it. And also there's been a focus on possible forced labor in these supply chains. So what would you be focusing on these days if you were in-house counsel?
Thanks, Kerry. I think that it's good to build off of some of the points that Doug raised, which are absolutely spot on. While we deal with this lack of materials or gap in our ability in the US to produce high capacity batteries to meet domestic demand, we have to deal with this tension of the increased enforcement of trade remedy rules that can result in import bans or steep tariffs or import quotas as a result of some of the problems that Doug raised, like forced labor. Many eyes on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which passed at the end of December of last year, but it raises critical questions about how to analyze your supply chain, how to comply, how to get the information that you need from vendors. And this is not the same in every industry. It's quite different, for example, in the high capacity battery space than it would be in a product that's maybe made of only one raw material. So in terms of what needs to be done, engage in the process that's happening right now and make sure that those difficulties are fronted. There will be a comment process by the Forced Labor Task Force. And it's important to have these commercial realities and difficulties named. One other quick one is on other border measures that could be imposed. As you noted, the supply chain report sets out multiple hard-hitting trade remedy policy and enforcement options, and the administration has already initiated the Section 232 investigation into neo-magnets. That was initiated in September, which means by June of this year, we should hear on the policy and recommendations. It's a sign that these similar tariff acts, national security tariff enforcement acts, could be used to result in import bans. We have also learned, though, that there's a pretty nuanced exclusion process that the Department of Commerce has now had underway since the steel and aluminum 232 tariffs. Hooking onto those and the lack of available US capacity could be a way to navigate these future risks as we go forward.
Thank you so much, Christine. And going back to the emphasis that the administration has put on trying to encourage manufacturing of high capacity or large capacity batteries, as we all know from a high level perspective, tax policy can be used to discourage certain activities or to encourage certain activities. And in this case, the DOE, the Department of Energy, has recommended a number of tax incentives to encourage manufacturing of these batteries in the US and related items like electric vehicles. Rafic, can you talk a little bit about that and what companies should be focusing on when it comes to the administration's policies affecting taxes?
Sure, thanks a lot, Kerry. Yes, exactly right. I mean, in the paper and policy paper that you mentioned, the administration recommended that a number of tax credits be available specifically for this industry. And the way that the rules work is, they would actually have to specifically add those types of credits. So the existing credit regime in the US wouldn't cover, for example, any manufacturing of EVs or batteries in the US. So that would have to be specifically added to the legislation to be eligible for tax credits. But beyond, sort of the very specific recommendations that they made, folks may have been noticing, that the Build Back Better Act, which has been pending in Congress and now potentially in a stalemate, but that included a number of more generalized tax incentives, some of which could be very relevant here. And those are intended to encourage R&D activity and manufacturing activity in the US. And to the extent you qualify for those, you would then get a reduced, rate of tax effectively down from the 21% corporate tax rate to something lower to be determined. And so those are the types of incentives that I think people will want to keep an eye on. as the legislation sort of passes through Congress and in whatever shape that takes. And then once we get the legislation, it will be very important to take a look at the requirements to satisfy for the credits or the reduced rate of tax, whatever the case may be, because those rules tend to be rather prescriptive too. And so it would be important to just pay attention to what exactly is required in terms of needing to satisfy for those incentives.
So there's a lot to keep in mind, both things that have already been implemented, but even more so, it seems, issues that are on the horizon. So developments that we can be keeping an eye out for that may affect any company who's operating in this supply chain and maybe manufacturing or sourcing high capacity batteries. So I wanted to just ask finish things up today by asking, what would be your key takeaway for an in-house counsel or compliance or tax professional in a company to be thinking about as they try to keep their arms around all of these developments and the risks that they may impose on their companies? I
would say, watch this space carefully. I think we'll have some clarity in the next couple of weeks around what will happen with Build Back Better. And once we do get that draft legislation, we'll be able to have a better idea of exactly, what the requirements will be in terms of needing to satisfy for the credits. So.
Kerry, I'd say that I agree. I think in the near term incentives, some of the incentives in the infrastructure bill and other things that are being put out there is really sort of the name of the game from the standpoint of trying to encourage the markets to grow and create a domestic market in particular. Whether that's going to be enough, because there's just issues with cost and how it's whether it can sort of sustain itself, especially a circular market where there's recycling as a substantial component to it. Without any regulation, I think is going to be a question. So then I would expect some follow-on regulation to mandate or push the market to go in a direction that's more sustainable.
And to wrap it up, I think my 10-second add-in would be to participate and engage on the import competition side, look for opportunities for duty mitigation, and for getting your views known about the practical difficulties in complying in some of the forced labor issues.
Well, thanks, everybody. I think you've left everyone with a lot of food for thought. It's interesting how the administration's policies to try to support this one particular supply chain can affect so many different legal areas. So it's not just tax or trade, but also environmental and others that we didn't even have time to touch upon today. I just would like to encourage everyone to keep an eye out for our other videos that we'll be issuing in this series. This includes a video on critical minerals and strategic materials. It touches on some of the issues we've begun to address today, given that there is some overlap and some of those minerals are actually used in the large capacity battery supply chain. So if you're interested in this conversation, you'll definitely be interested in that one. We also have a video coming up on the semiconductor supply chain and pharma and active pharmaceutical ingredient supply chains. So we look forward to hearing from you.